guess I'm stuck in the middle with you. And I'm wondering what it is I should do. It's so hard to keep this smile from my face. Losing joy and I'm all over the place.
Alright. So how is everyone today?
Doing well.
We have a nice everything? Tuesday, Wednesday? Thursday morning? Alright. Well, I did send out some updates. You know, I wanted to get ready, and so we'll make sure that we leave enough. We don't actually have a new moral struggle today, thank goodness. And I discarded 2 of the moral struggles too, so we're really down to just 3 that we have to master for the midterm, which you've already mastered pretty much. But I threw out the Hetch-Hetchy story, the moral struggle over Hetch-Hetchy, and I threw, although it's still a live moral struggle, and I threw out the moral struggle over a dinosaur national monument, just because I touched on it so lightly, and the struggle over our Snake River salmon, and the struggle over our Salish Sea Puget Sound orcas, and our struggle over the wolves. It's our struggle too, because it's our national park. The wolves on Isle Royal. I know it's spelled French, and it looks like, you know, if you're a sophisticated person, you ought to say Ile Royale. And some people in my family still insist on saying that, but normal people just say Isle Royal. The whole thing is a national park in Lake Superior. And I talked about it a little bit, but I'm also going to send out an email with a link to, and I'll send out the questions. I pretty much have the questions. Let's see, where were we there? I want to start on slide 32. But at the end of today's class, and if I have to, I'll skip ahead to make sure that we get to these. But these are pretty much the questions. I might revise them just a little bit, and this is not the formal version, but it's pretty much it. I've pretty much figured out 5 questions. And so I'll take home all open book, open friendship with each other, you know, open sharing, talking, discussing, meeting up, you know, trying to see how you can perfect and improve and get more insights from your classmates, from your community members, your scholarly community members, and everything like that. And just go home and over the weekend and sometime before class on Tuesday, answer these 5 questions as best you can, all right? And I give you some guidelines when I send out the formal version. I'll give you some guidelines too, you know, in terms of word estimate, you know, how many words per question. These are basically short to medium length essays is kind of what I'm looking for. And then it'll be like I said, we'll take a story, we'll take a moral struggle, and then I'll ask you to articulate the response, the way that a particular tradition that we've looked at would address that particular moral struggle. Okay, so in this case, we only have one question about this, and this is the topic that look, I'm already getting into this, so we'll just do this now. But this is the topic where I'm asking you to have a look at an essay. It's a short read, it's an easy read, and it seems, you know, when you go to it, oh man, there's 22 pages or whatever. Don't worry, like the last 6 or 8 pages are all, you know, note annotations and all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, the footnotes are important. They're just like 12 brief footnotes. Make sure you read those too. But the essay itself is an easy and very quick read, and it's about this particular topic. It's about this particular moral struggle. Okay, and it's written by 2 biologists and an environmental ethicist. The environmental ethicist is a fairly prominent guy named Michael Nelson, who teaches at the University of Michigan and has actually created, seems to have created these really cool alliances between what he's doing in the philosophy department at the University of Michigan and what the Park Service is doing. So it's kind of cool. I'm not sure, I don't know the specifics on that, but I know that he's actively involved with this research team that's the longest running. They've been there since 1958, not the same guys, but there's been a team studying wolf-moose, predator-prey relationships since 1958 on Isle Royal. And so anyway, and the guy that's been there the longest is a guy named Rolf Peterson, and he co-authored, along with another biologist, along with Michael Nelson, the environmental ethicist. They all 3 of them co-authored this essay that I'm asking you to read, which kind of goes over actually it goes over 5 different sets of values that are involved in the proposition of new wolf introduction to the island. What's happening in a nutshell is the population of wolves has plummeted to just 3, and the youngest one appears to be deformed, appears to have a fairly not uncommon spinal deformity associated with inbreeding, and it's believed the other 2 are either brother or sister, are just way too closely related to breed, and it's not clear if they're even trying to breed. So basically, those guys are done. You know, those generations that followed the breeding, the alpha male and alpha female that crossed over on the ice bridge around 1949. And their population then exploded basically quite rapidly until they had about 50 animals in five or six or seven different packs on this 40-mile island. It's 40 miles long and about 12 miles across in Lake Superior. So now it's almost impossible for a new wolf to voluntarily swim to this island. Right? It's just not going to happen because the Ontario, I keep wanting to say, and whatever that part of Canada that's closest to the island isn't going to form another ice bridge. If we can trust what climate scientists are telling us about global tendencies. Maybe there'll be another ice bridge. But even if there was another ice bridge, the Canadian side of the lake has been built up so heavily in the last half a century that there's really no way for the wolves to even get down to the ice bridge if there was an ice bridge. So if new wolves are going to come to the island, they have to be introduced artificially, right? They have to be trapped in Canada and then brought over in cages and then carefully released and monitored by biologists, right? Like what they did in Yellowstone about 30 years ago and have done elsewhere. They did that in the Southwest too. Fortunately, there were some surviving Mexican gray wolves. I think that's what they're called, the lobos that live down there. And that one that Aldo shot was actually a very valuable wolf because it was probably one of the last Mexican gray wolves, that particular subspecies that lives down there. The last one. That might have been one of the last ones that was left. Actually, no, they weren't wiped out until the 20s. So anyway. So I just want you to think about this, you know, and it invites you to ask yourselves questions. I ask you, look, you know, okay, just take a classic Leopoldian. Don't try to wade too deep into the non-anthropocentric hints that Leopold gives us. Just try to treat Leopold, you know, like a conservationist, but a Group B conservationist, okay? And you can use any of these authors to help construct your argument, okay? Leopold, Norton, or Wilson, because I think it's safe to say they're all some sort of Group B conservationists, right? And Leopold might go beyond. These guys are self-avowedly anthropocentrists. They're not even worried at all about being accused of not being environmental ethicists enough, right? They say, well, you know, that's just too exotic. We don't need to even talk about that stuff, right? Anthropocentric is the way to go, and that's all the more we need. And Leopold at least gestures toward, but you can ignore that part of Leopold, right? And just treat Leopold like another anthropocentrist and answer the question from that point of view, all right? And that'll just show me that you've mastered Leopold, okay? At least that part of Leopold which I want you to have mastered before we get into the next section of our course. All right, and then these are a bunch of other questions, and these questions are all considered by the authors in the essay that I'm going to attach in a link to an email to you, which you'll read as part of preparing for this question. The answer to this question might be worth a little more points than the next three or the next four. There are 5 total questions, right? That's the first one. And the next 4 all have like showdown at the OK Corral, all right? In this case, over the moral struggle involving the Snake River salmon, all right? And it's going to be the wise users against the Group Bs, all right? Showdown at the old OK Corral, and just kind of read both sides as charitably as possible. And you don't have to, I mean, if you want to, you can evaluate, you should evaluate them from each other's point of view, but if you want to give me your own point of view, that's okay too. But it's good enough just for you to stick, you know, be the voice of the Group B conservationist on this issue of Snake River salmon restoration, and then be the voice of the wise user. And I'll get a kick out of hearing some responses, because I have already suggested to you guys that these cowboys out at the Mulier National Wildlife Refuge, to the extent that any of them are remotely aware of any kind of philosophical justification for the kind of private property, anti-regulation, anti-federal government, political views that they hold, right? Those are political views. What we ought to be doing with our land, with our federal land, right? To give it all back to the people, whatever that means. Take it away from the nasty federal government, right? And set up a people's committee to decide, you know, who gets to graze on these federal lands which are now claimed by the people, right? That's what they're saying. And what I'm going to say now is that if they have any awareness at all of any kind of philosophical underpinning for that political point of view, then they would be wise users, right? So I want to know what these wise users have to say about the federal occupation of the lower Snake River, by the military federal occupation of the lower Snake River, for crying out loud. Right? You look at that map, it should strike you, right? What the hell is the Army Corps of Engineers doing totally dominating our landscape? Such a huge section of our landscape, right? All the way from Bonneville Dam all the way to Lewiston, Idaho. They've got their footprint, huge footprint. And these guys are all about returning land, right? So let's see what happens. I'm curious. Who knows, they might be all in favor of taking out those 4 lower snake dams. You could construct an argument like that. But you always want to make sure that you reconstruct the philosophical aspects of these traditions carefully and properly, all right? And that would mean that you probably make at least a reference to the fact that their axiological orientation is strongly anthropocentric. With the wise users, you want to point out that they have this strongly kind of theocentric, design-oriented kind of arguments from design, natural law arguments, right? Teleological arguments, they have a very teleological reading of what we do to the earth. And how it's always good, right? Because it always comes out with that best outcome, right? And that's a very it's destiny, right? For us to conquer the earth thoroughly and to prepare it for the massive use of future generations, right? So anyway, these guys would probably say, yeah, we need to conquer the earth, and those dams are all good, but we need to reclaim them for the people, is what they would probably say. You know, which is interesting because 50, 60 years ago, the controversy, or 70, 80 years ago now, the controversy over developing the Columbia Basin, the hydropower capacities of the Columbia Basin was a controversy, was a big showdown between private corporate energy, private power interests, right, which were very powerful in Washington, D.C., had very powerful lobbyists. But because the White House and because of the Great Depression, both the White House and Congress were dominated by progressives who didn't believe that it was a very good idea to just give away these resources to these giant power monopolies and let them build the dams, right? And it's a good thing that they protected our interests, because and that's ironic, isn't it? Because these cowboys are calling for the privatization of federal properties, right? And that's exactly what the power companies and their lobbyists in D.C. were calling for in the 1930s, when all these plans for all these dams were being put into place. And fortunately, the federal government, acting on behalf of we the people, said no. You know, we have domain over all these rivers, all these waters, and we're going to build the dams ourselves. And and they made all kinds of deals, right? Bonneville Power Administration, low electricity rates for people in the Northwest, right? There are all these trade-offs that went into the deal that were really good for us, right? Including, of course, relatively inexpensive electricity rates. So what would the wise users say? You know, what is their position on it? I'm really curious to see. So I just decided that's kind of my little side flank attack on the wise users, all right? Although there might be some sympathizers among the students who are going to suddenly mount a counter attack against Professor Mulier, which is okay too. I encourage that. I try to be challenging, right? That's kind of part of why I enjoy my job so much, because I get paid to be challenging and to make these provocative claims, and then you might go home and realize, oh, he's actually a pretty conservative guy. If you got to know me a little bit, he's not really that. He just he says those things for effect. And who knows? Some of them I do believe. Most of them probably. Anyway, so there's the third. Did we go over the? Yeah. So it's going to be the wolves, from a Group B perspective, Snake River salmon restoration, and I insist that, look, what we're talking about here is not just Snake River salmon restoration, we're talking about removal of the 4 lower snake dams. All right, so Snake River salmon restoration, Snake River dam removal from a wise user perspective, and then the Group Bs get to respond and explain to the wise users that, well, okay, that sounds good, but you might be a little bit off track here, right? And that's where you get in all the ecological wisdom from Leopold and Norton and all this stuff. And Wilson, the great and you could include biophilia in that. Notice I divide up the Group B conservationists into these 2 kind of subspecies, right? If that's the family species, then there are these subspecies, or that's the main species, and there are subspecies. And 2 that we've looked at that I will identify for you as both subspecies of Group B conservationism are Norton, the analysis we read from Norton, and what we just read from Wilson. All right, and then question 4 is about the orcas, okay? And you're going to have to hold off on your animal rights arguments because that's not really an option. That we got into that. We got into that style of argument on Tuesday when we talked about Schweitzer, right? And those kinds of arguments will become more clear when actually we'll go back and talk about animal rights. One very perfectly reasonable reading of Schweitzer and biocentrism is that it's an animal rights view that's just expanded all the way out to encompass every living organism, not just those ones that are sentient or aware of themselves or have some other qualification that separates them, right? As long as it's alive, is what the biocentrists say. It has moral status. But those moral status of the individual arguments aren't really available to you. And I'm also not making biocentrism. I'm not making a Schweitzerian perspective available to you, all right? So just leave that aside. Set those arguments aside. Obviously, these are very evolved, very, very sophisticated animals, sophisticated at a level on par with humans. And they seem to be one of the younger mammals, too. I'm not sure how long ago these orcas evolved, but it strikes me that they're more likely among the younger of the mammals like we are, right? We might be the very youngest mammal. There are probably some that are younger than us, and what is that? What's the significance of that? It so happens that all the younger mammals are sophisticated emotionally and cognitively and communicatively and are highly social and exhibit very strong altruistic behavior toward one another and even toward other species. Orcas do that. There are very few animals that exhibit altruistic behavior toward toward members of other species. You know, humans are one, obviously. We have deep altruistic feelings for all kinds of other non-human animals. But you'll see orcas playing. There are cool videos of orcas interacting with dogs, and there's one with dolphins and cats. I could show that. It's so cute. Have you guys seen that? It's up here. Let's see. I really like these cute animal videos. Get a big kick out of them. I'm a cat. You're a dolphin. And there's nothing wrong with that at night. Be your friend. But you live inside the sea. That's not very compatible with me. Would be good if you got out there. Walk with me and take you home and show you my neighborhood. We both eat fish. All right, well, it's kind of cool, isn't it? Just I get off track a little bit because I was talking about interspecies altruism, which is a very unusual phenomenon in nature that humans have a lot of. And orcas do too. See, and I don't know for sure, but I don't think there have been any. I don't know how well this has been researched, but it seems that there have been no incidents of an orca in the wild attacking or threatening a human being. Even though, I mean, you've all seen the kayakers out there amidst all these orcas, right? And that's a good meal for those guys, right? They seem to like us. Cetaceans seem to like us in general. Am I off base and scientifically unsound in suggesting that cetaceans have an unusual fondness for humans? Perhaps? I don't know. Maybe that's all just kind of an urban myth. But there are these stories like that Cuban refugee boy whose family, I guess his relatives all drowned in the ocean when they were coming over on this boat from Cuba. Elian Gonzalez was his name, I think. This was maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago or something. It was when Clinton was president, I think. Anyway, but the fisherman who found him out there, all the rest of his family drowned, and the fisherman who found him out there says that there were all these dolphins around this boy, and they were holding him up, keeping him afloat, and that's what allowed him to survive. And there are other stories like that, and there are stories of dolphins intervening between humans and sharks, right? When a dolphin sees a shark circling and coming close to humans, the dolphins will. Sharks are scared of dolphins. Dolphins are much better, they're much more athletic. The ultimate athlete of the ocean, right? The marine athlete, just absolutely magnificent. And you can tell that they admire each other, right? They're very sensual animals. And anyway, I just love dolphins. All right, so the orcas in Puget Sound are very, very special relatives that I would ask you. And this, of course, these are all just invitations to do philosophy, right? Which you don't get very often in your life. But this is a take-home invitation to do philosophy. And in fact, they're all take-home, except the final exam. And even the final exam, some of you might end up taking it at home too. But there's a little more time constraint on the final exam. Anyway, it'll be pretty, if you put in the time, you know, and you really think, and you take seriously my invitation to do philosophy, which means to think, you know, meditatively, and to try to put together these different stories I've been going over and trying to reconstruct for you and put in simple form, right? You know, just go over the readings again, go over all of our lecture notes again, and try to reconstruct the whole story that each of these traditions approaches whatever moral struggle, you know, we're talking about with. You know, each of these traditions approaches the moral struggle with a whole set of, I don't want to say assumptions, but positions on questions about the nature of value, for example. Fortunately, it's easy because I've already told you these guys are all anthropocentric, so you don't need to do any heavy meta-ethical lifting and talk about these other non-anthropocentric, because we're even worried about them yet. But I just want you to get a handle on a little more sophisticated differentiation between different ways of being a humanist and an environmentalist at the same time, or an extractionist in the case of the wise users. And then the Pinchoians or the Group A's, they seem to be just hopelessly schizophrenic, you know, and they could come down all over the map depending on where your economic and other analysis about values takes you. You know, what do people want? What satisfies people? That could still go all over. I mean, I could even see the Pinchoians, the Group A's, coming down in favor of. They'd be less inclined, right? Less inclined than the, who's this? Oh, the biophiles, okay? So here I'm asking you to consider the orca restoration question from E.O. Wilson's point of view, biophilia. He coined the term, all right, so he deserves credit. What the heck, man? He's our resident biophilic conservationist. And he's not a philosopher, and all this other material we've been studying, I'm not quite sure if he paid a lot of attention to it. He's a biologist. He's a famous biologist, still alive. In fact, kind of got in the news a little bit last year, because he's in his late 80s now, 87, 88 years old, but he's still very active, and I'm not sure if he still teaches, but he probably still lectures and he writes. And anyway, he's very prominent, right? I mean, when he calls a press conference or puts his voice out there, people really pay attention. So last year, I think about a year ago, he called for, he put forward this proposal to set aside 40% of the planet's surface for wildlife habitat. And he didn't mean setting it aside from all human use. You know, he's talking about a whole system of wildlife corridors, you know, and trying to accommodate the humans that are there, but taking seriously the idea that preserving biodiversity is absolutely essential to the future of humankind, right? And so he says, look, man, it's now or never. We're amidst this cascading stream of extinctions, right? It's just accelerating and getting worse, and so we need to take drastic action and set aside 40%. I'm not sure I don't remember what he said about the oceans, but obviously we need to set aside huge sections of the oceans too, to ensure our future. All right, so he's really big into this, you know, a lifelong champion of biodiversity, a lifelong champion, a lifelong admirer and lover of exotic wildlife. That book is a really, really nice book. It's a nice read. It's published in 1983, I think, you know, so it's kind of dated. We are moving in a way chronologically. You know, I mean, we kind of pick up this thread of conservationism with Pinchot, right? He's clearly the grandfather, even the father of conservationism. And that was our first reading. And then we kind of followed it up a little bit with Leopold. And then we followed that up with Schweitzer doesn't really fit. Obviously, Schweitzer doesn't fit in the conservationist tradition at all. And I'm not. I thought about putting him later, and usually I do put Schweitzer later in the curriculum, later in the syllabus, in the reading schedule, if I put him in there at all. But this time I thought, okay, man, let's put these two classics kind of back to back, not back to back, but you know, have them do a summary of Leopold and then a summary of Schweitzer. And Schweitzer introduced us to this biocentric perspective, which we'll pick up later on. All right. So these are the assumptions I asked you to make for all and this is all pretty much, I upped a few years ago, they estimated at 10 billion to clean up. I thought that was awfully low, and it was a few years ago, so I just bumped it up to 25 billion. It may or may not be accurate, it may be a little in excess, or who knows, it may be way low. But I'm just asking you to, and again, here's that old, you know, frightening prospect looming its head again. This is part of it, right here, restoring the lower Snake River, picking up those dams. So, those are the kind of things I want you to be thinking about over the weekend. And like I said, I'll type these up in a final form and email them to everybody by tomorrow, okay? And I'll also provide a link to the essay by Peterson and Nelson and somebody else about the wolves on Isle Royal. Fascinating subject. I went there, and that's why I started to get really interested in it. My father's very fond, now that he's getting somewhat older. He's always been very active in the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations, and he's always gone backpacking for a lot. When I was growing up, we'd go 3 weeks out in the back country on 2 different trips. One trip that he led, and then another trip with just his buddies. That some of them would bring their families, and we'd go along too. Anyway, usually in the Sierra Nevada, although sometimes we went farther. Like one year we went to the Grand Teton National Park, but mostly the Sierra Nevada. But anyway, now that my dad's, he can still do that stuff. We just went to Yosemite a couple years ago, and he hiked. We went on he hiked a long distance. But anyway, he wants to slow down a little bit, so he likes doing these guided tours now. And he has a little bit of discretionary income, and he wants to invite his family to go along. So we went to Yellowstone over winter, which is just amazing. One of these guided tours, and got to stay in these really nice lodges. And we saw wolves from far away. We couldn't see them very close, but it was freezing cold outside. But we had New Year's Eve by Old Faithful. It was cool. But anyway, what was I saying? Oh, and then this last summer, no one else could go except me, because I'm more the free spirit of the family. I got free time in the summer, so I said, "Oh, sure, man, let's go." So we got to go to Isle Royal. It was not just Isle Royal, but it was a whole tour of I should just find that essay, because it has a good little map of Lake Superior on it. Right there. John Vucetich is the other guy's name. All right, so there's our little map of. It really looks. Can you see the wolf? Can you see it? See it? It's the head of a wolf right there, gobbling down some. He just gobbled up some yummy animal. That famous shipwreck. Edmund Fitzgerald went down, I think, right about over here. They just recently found it just a couple of years ago. They didn't know where it was. That's the shipwreck that Gordon Lightfoot wrote about. This is a storied lake, this Lake Superior. This is amazing. So we got to go all around. We started over here, and it's really nice. Michigan has done a great job of preserving its wilderness. I was very impressed with this part of the country. This is all the upper peninsula of Michigan, right? And then the main part of Michigan's down here. I learned that you can memorize if you forget the names of the lakes, of the Great Lakes, just remember the acronym HOMES, H-O-M-E-S. Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and Lake Superior. HOMES. Big deal, huh? What is this, kindergarten? Anyway. But this is just an amazing region. This is the Keweenaw Peninsula. And it's just this hidden jewel right out there. And the whole lake is very it's not as developed as you would think. All the other Great Lakes are pretty well developed around, almost all the way around. But Lake Superior, a lot of it's quite rugged. Most of the shoreline of this lake is quite rugged. And it's a really choppy lake. I got seasick on the way out into the island. But this is how we went. We went around here in Porcupine State Park. It's one of the nicest. I'm told that if state parks around the country, state parks were considered for adoption into the national park system, right, to be made in the national, if Congress was to consider anything like that, then Porcupine Mountain State Park would be the #1, top choice. Because it's really quite spectacular. And they preserved all this old growth hardwood. That Aldo Leopold, he comes up everywhere, I'm telling you. Around this region in particular. He initially proposed in the mid-1940s, or the 30s maybe, anyway, he proposed introducing wolves to Isle Royal. And then just a few years after he made that proposal, they came all by themselves. It was almost like the spirit, right? The spirit of the wolf that got into Aldo, right? right? You can get all woo-woo, get all mystical, right? I like doing that though. It's a cool story. You know, I mean, those wolves swam, or they crossed that ice bridge from Thunder Bay, from that area, in 1949, right? The year after Uncle Aldo passed away. So maybe the spirit got into him, you know, and then decided, okay, we'll take up your idea, and we'll just go over there, right? No, that's not possible. Because we're scientific-minded people, right? We don't think like that. I don't tend to think like that. Sometimes I do. Anyway, so yeah, this is the second largest island, second largest freshwater island in the world. I think the largest one is in one of these other lakes, in Lake Huron. And I think it's in Canada. But, what was I going to say? I forget. Anyway, that's what's going on. That whole island is a national park. There are all these other little islands around it that are part of it too. It's just a fascinating place. It's really fascinating. I just enjoy going there so much. There are all these private property owners that are they're just barely grandfathered in, you know, like it formally became a national park, I think in 1941. Right? It had been set aside and protected for longer than that, but it formally became, and that's when titles started changing, and that's when anybody who had a property on, there's lots of private houses there. If somebody was, you know, like 5 years old in 1941, then now they're, you know, in their late 70s or something, and they're allowed to continue maintaining their house and living there whenever they want, which is only in the summertime. That's the only time you can go there is in the summertime. But anyway, so it's just kind of interesting. And then when they die, though, right? When they die, those private properties revert to federal ownership, and it all becomes part of them. But lately, I guess the Park Service has been negotiating because they want those properties. They don't want those houses just to fall apart because then they'll become eyesores, and they also don't have the resources to maintain them. So those private, what do they call them? I forget. Those grandfathered-in people are getting kind of a break because they're offering their children now. If their children agree to maintain the properties, and their children can continue to come and use them, which is kind of cool. It's got a lot of history of kind of upper crust people, you know, going there and having a summer home. But that's all done with now, you know, since it's been a national park. They manage it for wilderness values. You know, it's just I encourage anybody to go visit that part of the country, that Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royal, and all of Lake Superior. The people that took us on our tour, the leaders, the tour guides, were a couple, a man and woman. And one thing that they did a few years ago was they set out to walk. They walked all the way around Lake Superior, documenting it, you know, with video and all kinds of documentation along the way. And they met all these interesting people, and they have a website about it. I think somebody made a movie about it, I forget. Anyway, they're really, the guys, they're so knowledgeable. It's just unbelievable how knowledgeable he is. All right, so I don't want to forget to get this attendance sheet going around, so I'll do that right now. And try not to forget to take our break.
So it is Ontario, not Manitoba.
Ontario, yeah. Okay, so let's get back to our lecture notes. So now we've done, you know, what I wanted to do, and now we have to get back and get into